In thinking about this, Hughie Lee-Smith in a scholarly context, for many years, I myself couldn't figure out how to fit him into my general survey of African American artists. But it's so good, that survey started out in the 20th century. It was 20th century African American artists. Now, we're almost in 23, so over the years it's changed, and you see different things in history as you go forward in life, right? So, and this is a great opportunity to revisit this work and think about what this work over time has told us. So, of course, one of the things that we see in this work is ideas perhaps of loneliness, alienation. We were talking yesterday, LeRonn brought up melancholy, but also possibilities. There's always the possibilities in this work. Hughie Lee-Smith was born in Florida in 1915, and so he's of the generation of Elizabeth Catlett and Charles White. He was born in Florida, but then pretty quickly his parents separate and he moves to Cleveland, Ohio. And we can see that as part of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North that takes place, beginning after the end of slavery into the next 100 years, looking for change opportunities. And early on also to signal his life as an artist, I love the idea that his middle name was his name was Hughie Smith. The middle name was Lee. But then he said, this is an art name. I'm going to be Lee-Smith. I love that. So you see that idea of possibility reinvention that you also see with what people were looking for in the Great Migration. We also, I think what is really exciting, or one of the exciting points about his work, is that he gives us the Midwest in a really interesting way. Usually American art history has been taught from New York. American art history is New York art history, and everything else is regional. But one of my goals, particularly because LA is my happy place, and I wrote a book about it, South of Pico, African American artists in Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s. There's a lot of different art worlds, and many of them come to New York because that's the financial center, right? But you just see different things happening based on what's happening in that place. And it's really exciting that he gives us Cleveland and Detroit. One of the things that, this kind of strange spaces that he creates, and we were just also talking about this earlier, is based on, Detroit's black neighborhoods as the infrastructure is not kept up in the 50s. I would say that a lot of that also you can see parallel with artists that I talk about like Noah Purifoy, John Otterbridge, who are using assemblage in the 60s and 70s, and others, right, to really think about that as well, and, the Watts Rebellion and 66 Signs of Neon that somebody like Noah Purifoy put together at the Watts Towers Art Center in the 60s. So people are responding to their environments. But it's also not just, this is what it is. It's shot through with art. It's shot through with, in Hughie Lee-Smith's case, ideas of surrealism. In the case of somebody from LA like Noah Purifoy or John Otterbridge, it's about assemblage and what's going on here in terms of the art world. So I thought that was really interesting to think about, the kind of relationship seeing this work here. Another interesting thing to think about him is his relationship to the theater and to stage. One of the important black cultural centers in the 20th century was the Karamu House in Cleveland, and specializing, in theater, dance, music, performance, as well as visual art. So he was part of that. He was also connected with the Doris Humphrey, Charles Weidman-inspired type of dance, modern dance that was going on in the Cleveland area. So I found that to be fascinating for the kind of staginess of some of these things, right, which is amazing. And we see other people, so we can relate them to people like Thelma Johnson Street, who's another artist who kind of, in her case, bridged performance and painting, also at mid-century, and people who are more solidly in dance, like Catherine Dunham, Pearl Primus, but also another bridging figure, Richard Bruce Nugent, who you see from the 30s, and Augusta Savage. So these are all African-American artists who are bridging these worlds and showing us in their work parts of these worlds, again, not in a didactic fashion, but in a kind of fantasy or, an art fashion. And so in the 40s, there's very few opportunities for African Americans to show, generally, before the 60s. One of them is the Atlanta University Gallery annuals that is organized by the artist Hale Woodruff. And so Hughie Lee-Smith wins one in 1943. He's also included in one of the initial books on African American artists written by James Porter, Modern Negro Art. James Porter is at Howard University. Hughie Lee-Smith eventually goes and teaches there for a minute as well. So that kind of sets him on his course in some ways. Also, another interesting fact is he was in the Navy, of course, World War II. And like others, like Jacob Lawrence, people who were able to use their art skills, particularly painting, in the service of the military at that time. So he was doing morality paintings, as was Jacob Lawrence, right? It's about togetherness and Americanness, but more about integration as that starts to come onto the horizon or being pushed, right? Also, because of that, like people like Romare Bearden and others, Otterbridge and others in the Korean War, they get the GI Bill, and that helps them to develop their art-making practices. He moves to New York City in 1957 and teaches at the Art Students League. And has his whole New York life after that. But what we can see in how these paintings are arranged here, you can see him in his kind of social realist phase. If you look at this painting, I don't have the name of it, but the third painting there, that is really in the social realist phase, and you compare it with any of the other ones on this wall, you can see the kind of more didactic social realist underpinnings of the works like the ones here. So that's great to be able to see, and I know some students somewhere in LA have made this pilgrimage and seen all that. I mean, even the figure there, the skinniest man, you can see him trending toward or moving towards a kind of fantastical, what I would say, and what Romare Bearden and Harry Henderson kind of have called also a kind of surrealist trend, even in the staginess of people like European artists like Curator and others. Robin Kelly and his co-author, Mr. Rosemont, have talked about in their book, which I have, Franklin Rosemont, sorry, Black, Brown, and Beige Surrealist Writings from Africa and the Diaspora. And of course, Robin Kelly is a fantastic professor at UCLA in history. This is a book they published in 2009. And looking at, how we can see the relationship between the African diaspora and surrealism, some of the things they point out is that surrealism was always against things like colonialism, white supremacy, prudish morality, was against imperialism, and also in the 30s, the surrealist movement supported the Scottsboro Boys, who were wrongly accused and jailed. So that was a big, important case for African Americans in that time period that, of course, Huey Lee-Smith would have known about. And really, they were, thinking about, getting back to the surrealists, breaking down the borders between a kind of lived reality and a psychic reality. and seeing it as a kind of emancipatory movement also with materials, this idea of also a utopian movement. So they go on to talk about various people, who we can consider in that realm, more writers and poets, Mary Baraka, who I know quite well, and others like Quincy Troupe, music like that of Cecil Taylor. So they think about, even in that time, how these ideas of surrealism we can see being a part of African diaspora life, also including poets like Jane Cortez. They write, surrealism does not signify unreality, anti-reality, the nonsensical or the absurd. On the contrary, surrealism and open realism signifies more reality, an expanded awareness of reality, including aspects and elements of the real that are ordinarily overlooked, dismissed, excluded, hidden, shunned, suppressed, ignored, forgotten, or otherwise neglected. So if we go, especially with that last line, we can think about how somebody like Hughie Lee-Smith would fit in so perfectly to that. Really kind of giving us these ideas of the excluded, shunned, suppressed, but not in a didactic social realist way. I think in his own way, he decided, why do people have to be so didactic? Why is that the only language or message for African American artists? And he chose another path. There's another show up that I'm sure you all will go see on the artist Bob Thompson. And we can say the same for that person as well. That people looking at the world, what they're going through, and the world they are living in at that time, and saying, we're going to picture it differently, and give people something else to think about and look at. So that's my take on Hughie Lee-Smith. And I pass it over to you, Reggie.
Well, thank you. I'll try to bring a response, how I respond to Huey's work as an artist. Just straight from the gut, what the work does to me. And in that, I'm going to start kind of with a hierarchy of my own evaluation of my own work, but there's this hierarchy. So just touching on my practice a bit, I'm never concerned really about what a painting looks like. I'm never concerned about, I'm primarily concerned about how the painting feels. But before how it feels as to the viewer, I'm even more concerned about how it felt to me as I was creating it. And for good or for bad, I can shun work because it didn't perform for me the way that I needed it to when I needed it. So as I was making it, maybe I wasn't on my game. Maybe it wasn't a good day. But it didn't feel to me the way that it should. So therefore, I sometimes carry a stigma. Now, I'll follow along and not sort of get off the track. Huey is an artist where from the onset, it's how he makes me feel. One of the first things when I saw Huey's work is I felt like, ooh, I got to do more. Because Huey's work, you look at it and you think, man, I got to do more. And the reason why I say I feel that way, and I say that is because for me, in my work, I'm trying to get to the thing in the most ergonomic way, the most ergonomic and efficient way. And in that, there's a lot of things that are unresolved. And in Huey's work, there's this amazing ability to have this unresolved nature to it, but yet it's incredibly refined and clear. So starting with that idea of hierarchy, I'm telling you how his work makes me feel, and it makes me feel inspired to do more, that there is more and to do better. Now, this is from my gut. I don't know if this is going to make any sense. I've been thinking about it, but it's the take that I have. So I'm heavily influenced by years of music and having dedicated a portion of my life to music, particularly dub music, and playing that style. There's a thing that I'm forever trying to capture in that work, in my work, which is the space, how you deal with space and atmosphere. And so I'm going to propose in this idea that there's this connection that I do understand. I did study theater, went to school for theater and film. Huey, as you know, as Dr. Jones has mentioned, was a part of, one of the strongest, theater groups during that time. And so that influence is there, it exists. But what I'm proposing is this idea when you look at the work, is that in film often it's depicted this way often. There's an explosion, there's a sonic boom, maybe in war movies, there's all kinds of movies that depict it, but there's this explosion. And during that explosion, there's a silence and there's a hum. It's depicted this way in film, and I'm using it as an example, but everything goes quiet. And you've seen these scenes before where there's a sonic boom and there's then just a hum, a tone, and things go quiet. I think you enter Huey's paintings after that moment. There is this boom, and you enter after that moment, that quiet. Even when you think about and visualize the characters, they're sort of stunned and lost at this incredible, oppressive moment of something. And so I think about the work in terms of that moment and entering in. And then what comes to me is the weight. LeRonn has put it very beautifully, and he talks about melancholy. But in accomplishing melancholy, there's a weight to the paintings. And my thought, and what just keeps coming at me, and maybe it doesn't make sense, is okay, so we get the weight from grappling with the most major piece, which is gravity. And in order for the ribbons, and in order for this tone, and in order for things to move, there's a current in the work. There's a current that I see all the way through, which lends to this melancholy, which lends to the tone, which lends to the sound. For the ribbons to fight against gravity and to flow, for the balloons to fly and so on, there's something within that environment that's suspending it. So there's this suspension. And so there's this gravity and this fight, and then there's this current and suspension, and all of those things within the work fascinate me. But then to me, what I also see is another, from the theater standpoint, is the composition, foreground to background, looking at it from a proscenium arch sort of standpoint, where and how we view these works and enter in are a real masterful handling of how that's dealt with. What it feels like to see it from above or below, close or in the distance, all understanding that, and maybe that's the influence of the theater. But that suspension, that tone, that weight, that then lends to, around that idea of melancholy, right? It exists for me throughout the work. And in that final piece, another masterful bit is if you look at the work, there's also the justification of the light. So the light is justified in a certain way, but it is always in opposition of the current. Dresses flow, ribbons fly. It is never in the same direction. It is in opposition. You'll look, whenever someone is standing, or a lot of places, there's movement. And if you look at where the light is the source is coming from, and you justify the light, but then you look at the directional pieces of the costumes, they're in opposition, often. All of this stuff is done and made to look unbelievably easy and natural and refined. And so for me, it's the weight, it's gravity, it's entering in at that moment of this explosion. And there's much more well-defined ways of talking about characters entering and exiting. There's much more, sort of, but for me, my honest and raw kind of reaction to it is just always grappling with that gravity, which creates a tone, which creates a suspension, which creates the melancholy. Finally, it is all analog in its color scheme, right? It is analog. Like if you think of theater, you think of film, right? This is looking through a slide. This is analog, like, in my opinion. And again, all of this, like, I may be absolutely nutty, like, but this is just how I feel about it. But like, we're looking at it through the analog world. And so it's incredibly powerful, and I really mean it. Like, it is one where it makes me go, man, I need to do more. There's more. It's just, and that's how, there's much more to, of course, discuss, but like I'm still sort of grappling with that and figuring out how it all fits together for me. But I'm offering that as a way that I see it, and that's what I have.
Yeah.
That's the way I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like melancholy without leisure. I think that's what I said, right?
Yes.
All right, so there's a sort of sense of melancholy even for these kinds of landscapes that are so disheveled. You wouldn't think there would be melancholy, but it's melancholy without leisure, right? There's no pull. This is not a Diebenhorn. This is, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so, I mean, for me, it's going back to Kellie a little bit. What does it mean to be born in, 1915?
Yeah, 1-5.
Yeah.
1915.
Yeah. What does it mean to be born in an era which your parents could have been enslaved or your grandparents could have been enslaved? So to be born in 1915 is a whole set of social dynamics that he would have to overcome. I'm thinking about Paul Revere Williams, the architect. Born 1894, 93, 94. What does it mean psychologically to being the first in your family to actually think about becoming something different than what a sharecropper, what your parents had been, right? And so psychologically, what does it mean to be born, I guess, or to travel to the north now, the Great Migration, as you brought up? What does it then mean to be like, so, my parents are from Alabama, but I was born in Queens, right? My understanding of what it meant to be in the world is different than theirs. The things I had to understand in order to navigate New York is different than theirs when they were raised in segregated Alabama, right? And so we think about Hughie Lee-Smith, the psychological dynamic of being, I guess, the first in your family to think about art as a career, right? And what does it mean to then you brought up Lee-Smith, how we changed his name. See, people begin to remake themselves during this period, right? People begin to psychologically, actors change their names in Hollywood. You get to a new space, you then start to sort of inhabit that identity or who you think you can become because, you're away from the roots of your family, right? You're not in Florida, you're not in Alabama, but you're in somewhere in which you have to begin making the roots. Right? And so, I look at his work and I think about how important Cleveland was as a city that allowed him access to schools, right? And so these very basic things you just cannot take for granted if you're African American and born in 1915, right? I mean, what did it mean that the Cleveland Museum, led him into the art classes at the Cleveland Museum where he began to learn the foundational things you're picking up on, right? The Renaissance methods. And so you look at his paintings, this is completely grounded in Renaissance, understanding the Renaissance perspective, plein air perspective, card over card, form over form, right? Overlapping, and then you have single point stuff. And so this is really grounded in the fundamentals of what it means to make a painting, right? But it also makes sense that, okay, so he goes to the Cleveland Institute of Art. What does it mean that now he has a sort of higher level of art education and he's meeting these professors who are changing his life, right? He's meeting professors who are introducing him to surrealism. He's meeting professors that sort of give him new things to think about in terms of, okay, I don't want to be a realist per se, but realism, as you noted, right? Realism is definitely part of, but not so quite over the border toward abstract expressionism, right? Not so where your method mirrors the sort of madness of the ideology, right, in Surrealism, right? It makes perfect sense that he would move into Surrealism. It makes perfect sense, too, that a lot of his narrative is about loneliness, right? Because with this becoming who you are in the world, right? You don't, let's say he doesn't have a friend group who understands, right? Because your parents migrated to this, you know, and so you may have a sense of being African American during this time. You're in these spaces, and I mean, just loneliness. And how isn't that communicated, or how can that? Because that's his truth. How can that be communicated into paintings? But at the same time, how can you communicate your idea of where I amness? So when it gets to Detroit, what's happening in Detroit, right? Well, there's a lot of breaking down of the infrastructure. Buildings, highways, communities are, and so what would be surrealist, I guess, in terms of like how everything is broken up and it may seem like chaos, just in terms of what we think about surrealism, is actually a physical landscape too. It's actually walking around a city that's broken. Right? And what does it mean to have an idea about community? So there's all of this, you know, back and forth between the reality of what his life was, but then surrealism, or moving towards surrealism, or in that space, it being a very true sort of way for him to speak his truth, right? So.
Now to come up with some questions. Well, just want to go back to this idea. There are a number of things I'm thinking about. We talked about yesterday also, the idea of the palette changing over time. Bearden and Henderson talk about that, how it goes from a more quote-unquote realistic palette to something that is kind of filled with pastels, a little bit more color shot through. And thinking about, you know, people like Amy Sherald, the type of color she uses, the type of palette, which really seems to come from this. I don't know if she would say that. She probably wouldn't. But just thinking about how the palette changes. I'm also interested in what you all make of all these targets. I mean, of course, there's probably plenty of paintings, and the people who selected this show said, here's another one, here's another one. We're gonna put these, you're gonna put targets, there's a lot of balloons, here's some more ribbons. We're gonna do that. So I'm not gonna say, as I tell my students, they look at one painting and think about the whole work. I'm like, nah, you can't do that. You got to think about the entire body of work before you say this is what they do. But nevertheless, in this particular grouping, we have a preponderance of targets. So I guess what is my question? What do you make of that? I mean, is that part of, you know, signaling, you know, kind of reality for African Americans in 20th century? Or is it other things? Also, how does the palette fit into all of this kind of, especially in the later paintings, especially these pinks, you know, there's a lot of pinks here. So what about that?
It feels kind of like proto-Renaissance in a way, just to reduce, because Giotto thinks that reduced palette, you know, that reduced palette helps you see it sometimes when you have like those accent colors in there, like the pink and the targets really remind me of like a carnival. I'm thinking of like Derek Forgeot to a certain degree, right? The sort of carnival, and that, you know, the landscape, it isn't the game in that melancholy, but that it's sort of not ironic, but there's a little bit of, it could be humor, you know, just to have that target, like the game of life, the game of this particular moment, and that being contrast to just a very kind of stark sense of melancholy. I mentioned the bizarre in our former conversation, but it's not quite bizarre. It is, you know, something where Edward Harper is esque. You know, there's something about maybe the Midwest, or there's something about these spaces in which you're left with contemplation. You're left in sort of these wide. You may see a brick wall over there, and you may see like a building, and so you have to sort of sit with it. And you know, when people call this regional, New York painting was also regional. It's also regional, right? And so, you know, this is, you know, someone sort of using the landscape that they were given, and he was in the WPA, right? And so this is sense of having a sense of purpose, you know, that sort of feeds into it. He's a citizen of a place. He's an observer. He's a witness. But you're also kind of entering his mind, processing the space as well, you know. But yeah, I think of like Giotto or one of the early,
Yes, thinking of Giotto.
you know, yeah.
When you said that color. Reggie, any ideas about that, targets and colors?
You know, I think it's well said, and I mean, the colors, going back to more kind of defining what I meant by analog and the colors and seeing something in the analog world. Obviously, right now in the modern day, that means something because we tend to view things digitally, you know, and we can make a choice to do something either analog or digital. But certainly for a while, you could only look at film, you could only look at a slide, and that represents an analog. And that has a hue to it. It has a, you know, Technicolor is a Technicolor because of, you know, just, but there's a hue to it. And when I think about that, and I think about the selection, and I do agree with the limited palette idea, I just think it creates an additional density and layer to peer through, and it also gives it again more leaning to the weight. And the targets for sure for me are gameplay. You know, I had done some work which sort of centered around your target audience, and it was called target audience. And I looked that the target is actually, you know, placed and fixed, you know, in ways, but then it also shows up on a figure, and multiple times on a figure as well. So I can't define that in a way that it means one thing or another, but I do have that all get sort of stirred up in a soup for me of the weightiness of the work. And those symbols lend to that on every level.
You mentioned the word symbol, and I was just about to write semaphore, you know, because I'm looking at the flags, I'm looking at the targets, there's a signaling there that I think is going on, and even if it is, you know, kind of about games and the carnival that I didn't get to go to because my grandmother wouldn't let me out of the house when I had to stay with her. I think that always those kind of stories signal something else is happening. That's the story that comes out to, I don't want to say hide, but is the kind of part of what the other story is that's going on. I wouldn't say when you have a target on the back of a man, a black man, that there's not something there with that. Also because we can see other people like Elizabeth Catlett has the target piece. There are other target pieces that are happening. So I think it's also in conversation with other artists who are using that. But I wonder, you know, what is the signaling? If we're going to say that they're flags, they're targets, they're these ribbons, I get this idea of the semaphore, of the signal. Is there something that you can say this about hands, what are they trying to tell us? But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, how is that idea of signal functioning here? Because I think there is something with that, at least in my kind of interpretation of these kind of objects that he's showing.
You know, someone like Jasper Johns would take it up later, right, with pop, and so...
Around the same time.
Right, at the same time, yeah.
50s,
Oh, yeah, yeah. And so it's like a known signifier, right? But carnivals, I'm thinking about it again, carnivals are also places of the misfit, right? You would have, you know, the whole carnival idea is a heightened reality, it's a surreality, and so, you know, I mean, there is that kind of thing, you know, so if you see the target, you see the flags, because, you know, all kinds of, like, flags and carnivals, like, where's that going? Is that just a color? What is that representing? Like, you know, and so, you know, we're entering this sort of melodramatic funhouse, almost, if you want to think about that way. But it's also, You know, I mean, to your point, you know, I'm thinking about the, what is that, the Twilight Zone episode when there was an atomic bomb, and this guy who loved to read, I'm going to Twilight, hold on, right? This guy, he loved to read, and, you know, everyone was gone, and there was a library, he felt like he was king of the world, and so there was that boom, right? That you said, that soundscape, the boom. And then the melodramatic part came, like he's just getting used to all the bricks and all the new world, the collapse, you know, looking much like this. And he said, yeah, he has all the books in the world, he's ready to read them, then his glasses break. Spoiler alert, sorry. And then his, but around the same time, Rod Sterling, like 1957 or so, right? Yeah. And so, it's that kind of reality I'm thinking, right? And so even in, what is that new Jordan Peele one? Nope. Right? Right, didn't have a carnival-esque kind of, and so, I mean, there is that sort of spectrum that he's playing with there, and maybe it's a precedent, but it's something, I think this particular zone is something that artists have also always kind of sort of flesh out in their own way. I mean, for me, Jackson Pollock would totally deconstruct this because he's the next generation, right after the Surrealists. He's trained by Surrealists, you know, Siqueiros and what have you. And so, you know, they do it explicitly, but there's a way that he's finally detailing a deconstruction, you know. And sound is a part of it. Definitely.
Sound, yeah. Yeah, to continue on with the idea of sound, there is that silence that I mentioned that comes after this sonic boom, and then there's this hush and quiet, but there's also this buzz, this for me very palpable like undertone, which is also a hum, a sound, you know, that for me carries through the work. And now to continue to go back to, or maybe expand on this idea of gravity again, but that in a carnival sort of atmosphere, like there is all this movement, right? And you know, ribbons and balloons and you know the festiveness of that, but there's movement which draws you in, which frightens you, which thrills you, which, you know, there's all these things that are coming together. But what I feel about the way the work presents is that it is very much rooted, though, in like a heaviness to me. Not a heaviness as in, you know, a downer or a heaviness that is, you know, but a heaviness and a weight. And I just can't. I'm really trying. I can't get away from then the nature of him grappling with gravity and what he puts in view for you to understand that law of gravity, which if we're on this planet, is in play. And so these things aren't possible without that. And maybe then we look at him personally and feel what when we think about gravity and really bringing you down, you know, as you're trying to ascend. What is that, you know, how does that play into this? But as I describe it to you, it feels very abstract to me, but it is, again, as I say, my gut for me to really enter in. One of the things that I think is amazing, and we might have mentioned it, I read let's just say it was a small sort of passage, and I'm going to loosely paraphrase and probably get it mostly incorrect, but the idea was that Hughie Lee-Smith felt like that there was a strong level of representation, and that representation needed to be clear, that it needed to be concise and be able to be consumed by the masses. That was important. It was important that it was not just abstraction for lofty ideas. Like it needs to be rooted in something in a way that you can understand and that's clear to its audience. And what I also feel like is so masterful about the work is there's a ton of abstraction in the work, a ton. Even, you know, when you look at you get up close on when there are features and when there ways in which the body is dealt with. But it all over the painting, there are moments of real precise focus, and then there are moments where it is complete abstraction. And to pull that off within one work is, I mean, to me, that's amazing stuff, you know. So, Ron, I don't know if I picked up on where we left off or not, but yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, we're also in the age of Hiroshima, the dropping of the atomic bomb.
Yes, yes.
Right? And so we can think about infrastructure in terms of American, I mean, this is also a critique of American infrastructure or the lack of investment in infrastructure, meaning that cities are falling apart, inner cities are falling apart. But as a veteran, right, he was in the Navy,
Yes.
very aware of the atomic bombs that were dropped, right? And so there is a surreal context, but those real life acts are kind of surreal in and of themselves
Yeah.
when you think about it. So.
Yes.